Hello CIS18A, this is part 2 of our Unit 5 lecture, which we're going to talk about Swing. And Swing is a collection of classes and interface that support visual components such as buttons, text fields, scroll panes, checkboxes, tree, table, and those are just only a few. So collectively, the control is powerful in that it is easy to use graphically interfaces, and Swing allows us to provide the graphical user interface framework. AWT defines the basic set of components that support usable but limited graphical user interface. The more modern approach is to implement JavaFX, and the reason why I wanted to implement Swing is that there are potentially courses and also, employers that prefer that you would use Swing. However, you can look into JavaFX and how you can implement components with JavaFX. So for the component, it is written in entirely Java. They translate to how we can build the graphical user interface. It gives you a little bit of background in how you can implement the model view controller architecture, which correspond to state of information associated with the component. And very much like all the other graphical user interface development in other languages, you have to think about how you would design to control your component and each of the component, how it would be driven by specific events. For example, if we implement a button, it's designed to be clicked, and we want to have some kind of action to tie to that clicking event. So the two key items in GUI consist of components and containers. Component is an independent visual control such as push button or text field. Okay, so it could be a text box where the user would enter text strings, or it could be components where that would mean that would be button, drop down menus, etc. The container would be the area where it holds the group of components. A container is the larger aspect where it's designed to hold other components, not just one independent component. So all Swing GUIs have at least one container, and so when we put it together, we have to think about which container each of the component is coming from. So Swing components are derived from the JComponent class, and it provides the functionality for the common all components. So under that class, you would have subclasses. Now, the way that we would use this is we would use it from the JavaX Swing package. And since, some of the components in that particular container might have been depreciated where we no longer use applet, for example, but we do have different areas for the graphical user interface that we can expand using Swing components. So the containers, there are two types of container. We would have the top level container, which is at the highest level, JFrame, JApplet, which is now retired, JWindow, and JDialog. So let's think about it. From a user standpoint, you would often see some kind of window, and in that window that it would contain other components like buttons, options, checkbox, etc. Or it would be a frame, or it would be a dialog box to present an error or have you choose yes or no. So that will be at the top level container. The second type of container is going to be supporting the lightweight container. And this inherit from the J component, so that would be scroll pane, panel, root pane. Things that would allow us to control the window or the frame interface. This is what we call the lightweight container, or the lightweight containers. And so this would have the subgroup control for the outer container. Each top of the level container defines by panes, and JRoot pane is a lightweight container whose purpose is to manage other panes. It helps you to manage the optional menu bar. The pane is called glass pane, and content pane and layered pane. So in order to really see the components in its entire property, we have to utilize what we see as from the JRoot pane or content pane, or it could be layered pane. So pane allows us to give the component index value, and it's determined by overlaying one another. So we can have one pane overlays the next. So the layered pane holds the content pane that would be for optional menu bar. Now, when you're working with pane in your application, you want to think about how your content would be used or accessed, and that would mostly come from the content pane. This allows you to add visual components. You can add buttons, you can add top level container, you can add content pane. So ultimately you're using the content pane when you're adding buttons and the visual components for your user. So the layout manager allows you to position your components. It allows you to control borders, grids, box, and that's going to be physically where the user can visually see whether it's left, right, bottom, top, the position of your components pertaining to borders, or if you wanted to do like a grid for the table, the size of the component. So layout really shows the dimension of the components and the geometrical area of the component. So here it explains how the border layout and using the layout manager with the content pane. So first we have the frame of the window, then we would have the pane, so that way we can implement different components. Then when we implement the components, we would incorporate the layout of the components, how it's going to be pertaining to the physicality of that particular pane and window or frame. So the program that's shown in the example, it uses JFrame and JLabel. JFrame is the top level container that would be used in commonly used for Swing applications. JLabel is the component that make a label, and label simply is used to display the information on that frame, or we can have the label onto a window. If you wanted to display text, let's say a company's name, you would then use a label. So to start, the first line here allows us to import Swing. So you have to import javax.swing using the asterisk, so in the entire content. Then we would create a class, and in this case it's a public class called Swing Demo. we would create a JFrame container. So first we have to set up a container, and we would use the constructor and new here, new type. So in that container, we simply would pass a value, and in this case it's a string, a simple swing application. Then we would start with the layout where we would have the dimension of the frame. This is going to be its size. So JFrame size, set size. Then next what we're going to do is we are going to terminate the program when the user closes the application. So we want it to have some kind of operation to exit from that frame. Then we're going to create a label called JLab, and the text that's going to display on that label is going to be GUI programming with swing. We're going to add the label to the content pane by using the add method here. And we wanted to make it visible on the frame. Then in the main, we simply invoke. So this is going to create the frame on the event of dispatching the thread. So swing demos must be created on the event of dispatching the thread. So that means that when it runs, it's going to show the frame a simple swing application, and then it's going to show the label, which is the text inside that. It's going to say GUI programming with swing. So here it gives you the explanation of the pieces in that program, each line, and the section of the code snippet. Now you can start, like I said earlier, with thinking about how you would have a frame. Then you can set your pane, then position and size. Then you can add the component, which is going to be label, button, text field, etc. So important in graphical user interface, and particularly swing programs are event driven. We want the user to interact with the component. So an event is generate when that interaction occurs. Click of a mouse, enter text into the text field. So all swing GUI components must be created and updated from an event dispatching thread, not the main thread of the application. So when main is executed, it executed the main thread. It cannot directly instantiate the object from the component class. So what will happen is, to enable that as an event dispatching thread, you must use or create or define methods from the swing utility class, like invoke later or invoke now and wait, to be able to instantiate the event dispatching thread. So here it gives you a little bit of details on the bottom of this page, where it goes over the layout manager and how to implement that with swing. Also, swing event handling, as we mentioned, that is event driven. Components interacting within the program throughout the events. When an event is sent to the program responds to the event by use of an event handler. So it's important that event handling is part of the swing application. It's a mechanism that's going to be part of the event model. So the listener simply waits to receive the event. Once that it arrives, this listener would process that event and then return. So the listener is always going to wait for an event to occur. When the user click the button, that means that the event is then generated. It's going to process that event and then it's going to return. So we want the user to click an option. It's going to return that option in value, and it's going to be able to delegate that and bring that to the next step. So we wanted to make sure that the listener is registered, and it's going to be sequentially ordering based on the receipt or how the event is received. Also, just to clarify, an event is simply just an object that has a state change based on an event source. So the superclass for this is Java util.event object, and event specifically related to Swing is found in JavaX Swing event. And event sources is an object that generates an event. It sends an event all registered listener. So in order for the listener to receive the event, it must register to the source of the event. And the listener register of the source by calling the method on which the event source is. So when we use add type listener here, we need to include the type of listener, and the type is the name of the event and the reference of the event listener. So the listener simply is going to raise the alarm when the event occurs. It's always going to listen, and so that way the event can be processed. It can return the value, and it sequentially would move down the order that way. So here it talks about the event classes and the corresponding event listener. So one of the components that you often would use when you're designing graphical user interface is you would use a push button. And push button inherits from abstract button class. It's basically a common functionality for all buttons. So we can have some kind of name for our button, and we would use J button. But then we need to have an action event, so we can add and remove. We can use an action to process the event for when that button is pushed. And when the button is pressed or pushed, the event handler is called when that event occurs. So when the user click on that button, the event handler is the event handler that's going to call the button press that has occurred. So while this screen capture is small, you can make it larger and take a look at it. Here we need to import these for Swing, AWT, event, and Swing. Here we create a label, so we would have a class button demo implements action listener. Then we would create a label. Then once we have the label, we would create a frame. It would have a button example. Then we would be able to set out the layout for our frame. So it's going to have the size and how it can be closed or at exit. Then we would add two buttons. So we would use J button here. It's going to go up, it's going to go down, and basically we constructed the button up and down here. But it won't do anything until you tie it to the action listener, so that way, and then we can also add that to the content pane so it can be seen. So the action listener is added here, and we wanted to add the buttons to the content pane. Then we wanted to have a label near the button that says press a button, so that way the user can choose either up or down. Then after we make a label, we want to make sure that we add it to the frame, and we want to just show it on the frame. So when you create a label, it doesn't necessarily show up. You have to make sure that it's added to the frame, display on the frame. Now, the events for the button, since we added the listener up above, we would then have the condition. If it's going to be up, then it's going to show you press the up button. Otherwise, else, it's going to show you press down. So when the user click up, it says you press the up button. When the user click down, it says you press the down button. So now in the main, we would use swing utilities, invoke later, and then we would have a method called run, and then we would create the button, or we would call the button demo. So at this point, what would happen is we would tie everything together. So the takeaway from this is what? The takeaway is that when you start, you need to import in your packages for Swing. And these are going to be for event, all the content of Swing, and then also the AWT. Then when you add the components, you gotta make sure that your frame is set up, size of your frame. Then when you add the components, you gotta have an action listener for your components. You got to, if it's a label, you want to make sure that you add the label to the frame so that way you can display. The same thing with the button. You have added the button, but you wanted to make sure that it's visible onto the frame. Additionally, since a button would generate some kind of event, we already created the event listener. We want to make sure that we apply the condition for such event. Press up or press down, and we wanted to have, after the actions for the main, we want to tie everything back by using by creating the event dispatching thread. So here, this allows us to create the event dispatching thread. Otherwise, nothing will work in our program. So you can also add a text field. This is where the user can input from the keyboard. And we can have specific field. We can line it up. And text field can be entered as command strings. You can set with command strings so that way it would not be affecting in how that text is going to be entered and recognized. So the program for that is below. And in this program, again, we imported the Swing packages and the event packages, AWT packages. So we would start with the class. It's going to implement action listener. Then we are going to have the button, text field, and a label. So here we set up the abstracts. Then we're going to start with the frame. Give your frame a name or some kind of text display. we're going to start, and then we're going to have a flow layout. We're going to have the size for the frame. So that's your back, right? Your background there, your frame background. Then what you're going to do is you're going to allow that to be control, how they're going to be exit on close. Next, we're going to add a text field. So here we construct a text field. Then we would use the action command in the text field. That's going to be showing what they should enter, my TF. Then we're going to create a reverse button, like an undo button, sort of, right? And then we're going to add the listener to it. We're going to add the label to, so that way the user can see enter text. Then once that is created, then we're going to have to add the label to the content pane, because frame and then pane and then component. So we already created the frame, then we created the components. Now we got to add it to the pane, so that way we would see here. Then we're going to display, make sure that the frame is visible. Then we have to tie the action to the event. So we would then create event. We would hand it over to event handler. Then we would establish the condition on when the button is pressed. And so if it's pressed, then because it is a string, we wanted to have the for loop implemented here. It would store that string, otherwise it would enter is pressed while the focus is on the text field. So if the user type and press enter key, it's going to store that, right? It's going to display what they have typed. Okay. Lastly, we would have the main method. And with the main method, we simply dispatch the event thread. And we are going to basically call setup void run and then use the TF demo, which we had previously set up in the other class. So here you can see that this is a program that we have a text field, we have a button, and we tie all of those components together. We use the pane, we added them to the pane, we constructed the frame, how the frame is going to show these components and position the components. And that basically ties up our program. You can also create checkbox and other components. So in the last part, it talks about checkbox. You can, it basically inherits from the abstract button, and that's important to know because as you bring in some of these object type, we want to make sure that we understand its superclass. And then toggle button. Now with the checkbox, this is the example for the checkbox. Sorry if it's not very clear. But with the checkbox, you're able to implement options. So it's slightly different than when you would use the regular button, but they would still have to click that option. And when that option is clicked, it generates an event. So it needs to be handled and it needs to be able to store. And so therefore you have to dispatch the event thread. So ultimately, all of these components that we talked about, the example that we talked about so far, it's event driven. So therefore you have to generate, you have to create the frame on the event dispatching thread. You can have a list, a J list, which allows the user to select from the list like a drop down, So with the list, you have to have a scroll, right, where the user can scroll up and down. So you have to add the J scroll pane. And also we have to use the list selection listener. So in this section, it talks about the various type. It gives you example of how you can create a list. You can check out the example. If you have the book, the example will look clear. You can also download some of the source code so you can see. So in this one, we create a list of names and going through to create the new list after we set up the frame, its layout. And then we add that list to the pane. We also need to have the J scroll pane. That's important for the list. And then we would add the selection listener because it's using the list listener instead of the list selection listener instead of just the regular listener that we normally deal with the regular button. And then we would add the label to the content pane so that way we can show and tell the user what to do with the current selection, and or we would prompt them to choose a name. Then lastly, in the main, for our main, we would incorporate the event dispatching thread, and that you have seen in all the other program as well. So here gives you the explanation on the JList program that we touch on in the specifics, so check that out. Now, Swing is not difficult once you get a hang of it. If you understand how to utilize object to access all of these the library already exists. You just have to know what to be used from a certain library, and that does take some practice and review of documentation. So the notes is only going to give you a fraction of what that would be in the library. So I encourage you to take a look at the documentation that Java that Oracle provides and maintains, so that way you can see a little bit more what other components you can add into your program. And of course, the internet has wonderful tutorials that you can find. However, designing graphical user interface is only effective if you really understand how the background of each of these components, what is used, what is necessary. That's what we talked about with EventListener and how to handle event and be able to have specific dispatching thread for your event. And this ties up my part 2 of CIS18A. Please take a look at chapter 16 or your notes and try out the example. I do have a couple of very simple exercises for the lab. Take a look at those programs and see if you can understand what of those, what components you added and how to really program it. If you're using IDE like Eclipse, it's more swing friendly, so it's definitely give you, it simplify a process a little bit, but understanding essentially is important because yes, we can drag and drop and click and point and build our graphical user interface, but ultimately we have to understand the processes behind how it's using certain areas of the libraries, etc. Thank you for watching the video. I look forward to see your course project and releasing the final exam, and I'm sure that you're glad that this course is going to end in a week. And thank you for keeping up with the good work. I hope to talk or see you in the future classes. Take care.